Well, the virus has now killed more than 100 people in China, and new cases have been confirmed around the world.
So you don't want to frighten the American public.
France and South Korea have also got evacuation plans.
But you need to prepare for and assume
strongly warning Americans to avoid all non-essential travel to China.
That this is going to be a real serious problem.
France, Australia, Canada, the US, Singapore, Cambodia, Vietnam, the list goes on.
Health officials are investigating more than 100 possible cases in the US.
Germany, a man has contracted the virus.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
Japan, where a bus driver contracted the virus.
Coronavirus has killed more than 100 people there and infected more than 4,500.
We have to prepare for the worst, always, because if you don't and the worst happens.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome to episode 149. We're on the John Fredericks Radio Network on americasvoice.news, the streaming platform for the Trump Revolution. That is Dish Channel 219 on Newsmax TV, FM 99.1, 103.9 in Chicago, Nexus.org, IRRS throughout the world to 250 million English-speaking people. And also later in the day, subtitled in Mandarin on G News and GTV. Now with over 7 million downloads and 100 million views on Facebook, YouTube, all of it. Ubiquitous. The oldest and best show about the pandemic, where we talk about the economic crisis, the financial crisis, the geopolitics, and the political every day. And we're doing 6 one-hour specials all week this week on the geopolitics and the war, information, economic, and cyber war, the hot war of the Chinese Communist Party versus the people of China, the people of the United States, and all of mankind. Very honored now. I think this is day 4, right? We started with Edward Luttwak. We had episode 2 with Frank Gaffney and Brian Kennedy, and then yesterday just an incredible former CIA operatives and special operators talking about biological warfare. But today we pivot. We talk about really what this is about right now, and that's economic warfare. We're honored to have, I think, the smartest guy in the country and a guy that's been around and been a patriot, served his country for many, many decades, Roger Robinson. He's chairman and co-founder of the Prague Security Studies Institute. He's also the former senior director for international economic affairs on President Ronald Reagan's National Security Council. And he's also former chairman of the Congressional Study, the U.S.-China Economic Security Review, the Economic and Security Review. This is a guy that knows it, and he knows it for many, many, many decades. You see him in the news all the time now, which we're going to get to, talking about the economic war the Chinese Communist Party is running against us. Roger, thank you for coming on this special edition of War Room Pandemic. Very honored to have you on, sir.
It's a pleasure, Steve.
So I want to go back in time, and this helped us with Professor Luttwak the other day, and then with Brian and Frank, because I think we're trying to coach up the American people. We have a lot of hedge fund people that listen to our show. In fact, in the last episode, we were talking about some of the therapeutics on the live show, and one of the stocks companies were talking about, the stock skyrocketed. So we have a lot of the news producers, but principally we try to reach out to the deplorables and coach them up. And they're now, I would say, woke to what is going on with China. But one of the things we're trying to do is go back and talk about times when we've had this before. The most recent analogy and the best lessons, I think, come from the Cold War and from the group of patriots like yourself and Frank Gaffney and others that really came together as young patriots to work for and with President Reagan and really taking on the Soviet Union and bringing it down. Can you go back? You were essentially the head of economic warfare in the National Security Council for those years in confronting the Soviet Union. Walk us through what economic warfare is. Why is it so important? What did you guys do in the Reagan administration at the tip of the spear?
Well, Steve, as you know, the Soviet Union was seen as an invincible juggernaut on the geopolitical landscape of the world, that it was going to be there for our children's 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 children. In other words, it wasn't going anywhere, that we had to consign ourselves to the notion of being under the sword of Damocles of Soviet ICBMs, in effect, till the end of time. President Reagan, fortunately, didn't buy that. He saw a system that was a command economy with all sorts of rigidities, not responsive to supply demand, didn't permit entrepreneurship and true innovation and a kind of technological dynamism. He thought that they had clay feet. I was shared that view. I was used to look after the Soviet Union, Eastern Central Europe for Chase Manhattan Bank as a vice president division executive there, and I knew where the money was, but more importantly, where it wasn't. So as we faced Soviet troops massing on the Polish border, about to go in 1981 in December and declare martial law or just take over the country if they didn't declare martial law, it was at that time that the president decided, let's go after the economic side, the most vulnerable underbelly of the Soviet Union. Let's use our monopoly on oil and gas equipment and technology that we acquired through exploration in the North Slope of Alaska that nobody else in the world had. Let's boycott that equipment and ensure that the Europeans don't sell our licensed equipment out from under us to the Soviets, because they were working at the very moment that those troops were massing on the largest project in East-West economic history, the huge two-strand Siberian gas pipeline project, about 35 billion today, which would be 350 billion today. So it was a massive project that would have doubled, well, not only doubled their hard currency earnings, which were a paltry $32 billion at the time, about the equivalent of 1/3 of one American company like Exxon or GM at the time, but it would also take U.S.-European dependency on Soviet gas to well over 75%. Now, President Trump has bemoaned the fact that Germany is a kind of captive nation to Russia today at 35%. Imagine had there been no Reagan and he was looking at more like 80%, where the pillars of NATO itself were going to be eroded by the Soviets' economic warfare tactics. Nobody saw pipelines as strategic. It was all couched in commercial terms, much as the Chinese do today. And fortunately, I and some others were able to convince him that this was, in fact, a move that would neutralize, to a large extent, NATO, and he decided to take them on frontally. And in effect, it was that the rest is history. But I can get into some of the numbers, which are
But before we get into the numbers, I want to go back because people today have been so inundated with strategic and economic dialogue that the Russian, the Chinese are our partners. The Chinese Communist Party is just benevolent, authoritarian ruling clique for the childlike Chinese people because they can't handle democracy. I want to go back in time because when I tell people, if you think it's bad now, that's nothing compared to what the Reagan's posse went through in leading up to the victory in the 70s and then taking over. I want to go back specifically to Henry Kissinger and Graham Allison, the Thucydides trap. You talked about the juggernaut of the Soviet Union, but take us back there and talk about how there was no conception of actually confronting the Soviet Union. There was no conception. The concept of victory was Henry Kissinger had told people that Ronald Reagan was the most dangerous man in the United States because you guys were the first. It's not Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon. And you guys were the original wingnuts. You guys were dangerous. Take us through that.
Well, you're quite right. I mean, the CIA had a view of the Soviet economy as a peer competitor to our own, when, as I said, they were making a paltry $32 billion a year. They were spending $16 billion more a year than they were making. They were financing 100% of that from Western governments and banks. So we were picking up the tab, as it turned out, in that anemic earning structure that, like Russia today, and certainly then, was a petro-nation. 66% of their export earnings and income was oil and gas derived. And so this was a fundamentally weak economy that everybody thought was going to ultimately either keep pace with us or even prevail. And that's why you had the Kissinger-Nixon détente. The notion of commercial bridge building would lead to greater geopolitical cooperation. All they did was steal our technology blind, and in addition, went after us in every way they could using our money, that is, Western governments and banks. Gee, does this sound familiar vis-a-vis our Chinese friends today? So this was very much going against the grain. The president surrounded himself with a very small cadre of folks in the economic and financial warfare side of his broader strategy for the Soviet takedown. There were only about 12, 13 people in the loop in this, and it was kept so quiet because we needed the Soviets to believe that things were basically the old status quo. As we systematically put clamps on the life support tubes that we in the West were providing, we were keeping them a going concern. I mean, that's not an exaggeration. That's a fact. And I believe the same is true with China today to a large extent, which we'll get to later. So here we are in a situation where much of the cabinet of the Reagan administration was opposed to this, including the Secretary of State at the time, who believed that we were just unnecessarily estranging our allies, that this was going to be a mosquito flicked off of an elephant. And so there were very few believers. Bill Clark, the National Security Advisor, Reagan's best friend, former chief of staff during his time as governor, Bill Casey, Cap Weinberger, you know the names, but it was that very small cadre of folks that made the difference here. And thank God, because, yeah.
We got about 2 minutes in the segment. I want to get to this. One of the very first things you guys decided to do was to do a reset and think this whole thing through with a fresh set of eyes. It was Andy Marshall over the Pentagon and the Net Assessment Group and Bill Casey. This is kind of legendary. You guys did a complete, from the bottom up, remodeling of the Soviet economy. And what history tells us that you found out that the CIA, all the guys on the Hill, all the think tanks, that they had projected that the Soviet economy was 100% bigger than it was. It was only half the size. And when the story is when you guys described the thing to Reagan, he goes, well, how big is it? And they go, well, it's actually not the size of California. And he said, look, I understand you got nuclear weapons and everything, but what's the story here? How was it? Because when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about today. How was it that all the smartest guys in the room, including Henry Kissinger, got such a fundamental thing wrong? How did they actually blow it that badly?
Well, in no small part, it was the same reason that folks have this exaggerated view of China being 10 feet tall today. We have to remember something fundamental, which is their currency wasn't convertible. I mean, the ruble, whether it's the yuan or the ruble, these are not convertible currencies. They didn't really focus on the hard currency cash flow. I mean, if I could put it in one sentence as to breaking the code, it was going after their hard currency cash flow and going after the financing, which was their Western financing, mind you, which was their only exit door. And when we bricked up that door to Western governments and commercial banks, when we stressed out that hard currency cash flow by cutting off or limiting their natural gas sales to the Western Europe, which was supposed to be the centerpiece of their future earning structure, when we went to the Saudis and had them pump 2 million barrels more oil secretly into the market, when we decontrolled prices at the wellhead in the United States and oil fell to $10 a barrel, with every dollar drop in the price of a barrel of oil, the Soviets were losing $500 million to $1 billion on an income that, I want to say again, was 1/3 of the revenues of one American company. Forget California. I'm talking about the fact that they were 1/3 the size of General Motors.
We've got to come right back, Roger. A hard man talking about hard currency, one of the cadre with President Reagan that won the Cold War and defeated the Soviet Union. We're going to return with Roger Robinson on War Room Pandemic in just a moment.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to War Room Pandemic Special Edition, the Committee on the Present Danger China, the Chinese Communist Party's war against the people of China, the citizens of the United States, and all of mankind. Now joined by Roger Robinson, who was the head of economic warfare for President Reagan during the Cold War. If you had to walk the National Security Council through what you believe is the map, the battlefield of economic warfare today, given this juggernaut of the Chinese Communist Party in China, walk us through that, Roger. Walk us through what you would, the same way you walked President Reagan and Richard V. Allen, the National Security Advisor, walk us through what you would tell people today.
Well, as you know, Steve, there are many elements to this. There's the trade piece that the president has largely gotten right on the tariffs. There's the technology piece, which we're finally getting our arms around and realizing that we've got to do something much more dramatic there in terms of denying them those capabilities. But I would come back within the limited time we have to the centerpiece of this whole show that never sees the light of day, which is the money. It's about the money, whether it was the Soviet Union and their hard currency income or the way the Chinese are actually funding themselves today. I mean, you know, the United States dominates the economic and financial domain on this planet, utterly. They're playing in our sandbox. We're not playing in theirs. We created the international trading and financial system, and it's almost like we forget our dominant role there. Our capital markets are larger than the rest of the world's combined. We have 60% or more, I would say, of the world's liquidity in our markets. And yet, never have we looked at the Chinese penetrating and taking vast sums of money out of our capital markets, both equity and the bond side, the debt side. And right now, it's looking as though those numbers are something between $1.5 trillion and $3 trillion. We wonder how they have this unlimited checking account that they walk around with to capture nations, regions, and even continents in the case of Africa. It's because there's 160 million unwitting American investors out there that are seeing over 1,000 Chinese companies in their portfolios that they don't even know are there, put there by fund managers and index providers and ETFs and others that are picking up hundreds of Chinese companies, even from the domestic exchanges. So if I had to choose, getting back to your key point here, if I had to choose an area that is the most similar to and the most effective in terms of what we want to be focused on, it would be the money and who and how is the Chinese Communist Party being funded? And the answer is, sadly, it's us, without question.
How could that walk people through? I mean, people's heads are going to blow up in this. How could it be, if it's about capital markets, it's about access to capital? When you talk about that, that's really pension fund and insurance money, which is essentially the deplorables. It's every cop, teacher, EMT, soldier, sailor. It's the working class and middle class in these companies, retirement money, and the money in the insurance companies. How could this possibly be? Walk people through specifically how they do it. What you think the most egregious things are and the ones that you recommend we got to stop.
Well, for example, isn't it interesting that in the trade portfolio, where Peter Navarro and others have done such a fine job, that at least we have a CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. We monitor Chinese investment in the United States because of our national security related concerns. Do we see any similar screening mechanism for the capital markets in the last 2.5, 3 decades? Answer, no. Is there any diligence being performed on who are these Chinese companies and what are they about, and all of that in terms of the nature of these entities? The answer is no. We've let through national security abusers, PLA-affiliated advanced weapons manufacturers, South China Sea island builders and weaponizers, folks that are providing the wherewithal for North Korea to continue its missile and nuclear programs, folks that are helping out companies that are proliferating weapons to North Korea, Iran, and so forth, and egregious human rights abusers like Hikvision and others whose surveillance cameras are every few meters atop the walls of concentration camps in Xinjiang holding 1.5 million Uyghurs. This is the kind of companies that we are witnessing in our markets, and they're in the public pension systems of the 48 states. They're in virtually all of the university endowments, many of whom believe they have great human rights credentials, yet you see the nature of the surveillance state companies that they're funding, and the list goes on. It is a remarkable thing. Even our federal thrift savings plan of a $600 billion plan that has 5.8 million federal employees there, including our uniformed military, we're within maybe 2 weeks, a week or two, of a switch of their international fund of that particular thrift savings plan to the MSCI All Country World ex-US Index, a big name, but just know this, that when you have an index benchmarking a list of companies that you're going to invest in, it turns out that in that one, there are US sanctioned Chinese and Russian companies. There are all of the variety that I just named in terms of offenses, and we're going to have our uniformed military ending up very soon, if the president doesn't take action, that are funding companies that are making the advanced weapon systems that are fundamentally designed to kill them in the event of a conflict.
So listen, so Roger, people's heads are going to blow up when they hear this. And is the question, obviously they're not doing for ideology. Is it the reason that Wall Street, the hedge fund managers, the money managers, the endowment guys at the universities, are they making money off doing it? What is the logic of why they're doing this when it's so obvious? And so when you mention it, people's heads blow up about how this could happen. Are people making money? Are they doing it because they're lazy? Or is it ideologically they're trying to help the CCP become a more developed nation?
Well, they think that they're being good fiduciaries and expanding their investable universe to emerging market companies and capturing return on investment that might not be the case if they didn't have a kind of global view of investment strategy. I mean, that's what they'll tell you, and they're just being good fiduciaries. They don't talk much about the big fees that they're taking out of China, and China rewarding them when they put Chinese companies into indexes, for example, and penalizing them and telling them they'll never see another dime of business in China if they don't, like they did with the Morgan Stanley MSCI before it was spun off into an independent entity. That's why, I mean, there's a Wall Street Journal piece on this that talks about the arm twisting involved on that particular score. So it's about fees, it's about profits, it's about their feeling that they have to properly weight and represent the second largest economy in the world that dominates the emerging market space. So they have all kinds of elaborate rationales for this. And I'm sure that Hank Paulson and Larry Fink and others could come on here and give you a seminar on all of the seemingly benign reasons they're doing this. But what's really happening here? I mean, why isn't any diligence being performed on having U.S. sanctioned entities that we're not supposed to do business with by law, but that we can invest in, that we can fund, that we can give all the prestige of being in the world's deepest and most voluminous markets, a good housekeeping seal of approval that they use around the world every day to legitimate themselves? Does that sound like a sanction to you? How inconsistent could we possibly be here? And so the most obvious kind of diligence would uncover this kind of thing. Where are they in the risk section of the prospectuses? Where's the SEC demanding the disclosure of these obvious material risks? It's not happening, not nearly to the extent that it should be. And the list goes on.
Yeah, Roger, we want to thank you for being on this special. We're going to have you obviously on the live show going forward. But how do people get more access to you? I know you're founder and co-head of the Prague Institute, but is there a website that people can get more of your writings? Is there a your Twitter feed? Walk us through how people can get access to Roger Robinson.
Well, there's a website for the think tank, pssiwashington.org, and I have a company that looks at these kind of questions and does cutting-edge research on Chinese and Russian companies that we track every day, every global transaction of both in something called Intel Track. That can be found at rwradvisory.com, and we'll provide a number of examples there, and including an archive of some of the many articles that I've had the opportunity to participate in. So that would be a start.
Roger, I just want to say for our entire audience and for the 7 million download group we have on podcasts and the 100 million views we've got on all of our distribution platforms, you're an American patriot and a truly a great man. What you've done for President Reagan will be remembered forever, and you're the lead tip of the spear at a fight at the other end of your career. And I got to tell you, the work you've done is just incredible. So I want to thank you for our entire audience. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for the work and the grief that you've gotten in standing up for free men and women throughout the entire world.
Thank you so much, Steve. Very kind of you.
Roger Robinson. Okay, we're going to return with another economic warrior, Kevin Freeman. We return on War Room Pandemic Special in a moment.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
I want to thank the people at AmericasVoice.news, the streaming service, now Dish Channel 219 and Newsmax TV, for helping us put on these, in the John Fredericks Radio Network, everybody for helping us put on these specials. The Committee on the Present Danger of China, the Chinese Communist Party's war against the Chinese people, the American citizens, and mankind. We're now into our fourth hour. We're going to go through 6 hours of this throughout the week of these specials. Now joined by Kevin Freeman. Kevin's president of the National Security Investment Consultants Institute. He's also a certified financial advisor and host of Economic War Room with Kevin Freeman, now on Blaze TV. The guys over with Glenn Beck, terrific job, great show. And Kevin, the reason that you're unique among the other folks we talked to in this area, you've actually put forward this concept of economic warfare as kind of a discipline and an approach to warfare. You know, in unrestricted warfare, that was written in the mid-'90s, came out in the late 90s, the war plan of the PLA and the CCP against the West. The two colonels at the time of the PLA said, hey, there's information/cyber warfare, there's economic warfare, and they're kinetic. We never want to fight the foreign devils in a kinetic war because we can destroy them through information war and economic war. You've been at the tip of this spear for many, many, many years. Walk us through, in your mind, what economic warfare is, and how is the Chinese Communist Party fighting that war against the West?
Well, Steve, I first looked at this in 2008. I noticed unusual trading activity. I mentioned it to friends in the Pentagon. They immediately sponsored me for a report, which I did for the Pentagon, that showed that you could take down America by taking down our stock market. And, you know, unfortunately, nobody wanted to talk about that at the time. I did further research, discovered the same book, Unrestricted Warfare. I've been an avid reader of it for over 10 years. I've studied it. I've talked to as many people as I can about it. I even showed it to a former director of the CIA, and they said, I've never heard of this. Why haven't I seen this? And yet the copy that we have was spirited out of the PLA bookstore in Beijing, translated by the CIA. Basically, economic warfare is you take down your enemy without firing a shot. You destroy their economy so they become dependent on you. And the Chinese have been pulling it off since 1999. They've stolen our intellectual property. They've moved our industries to China where they have control. They have violated trade practices, all everything you can do with the currency, making the currency too weak, making the currency too strong, and now they're targeting us for a kill shot, and this virus gives them that opportunity.
People's, one of the things we're doing, you see this in the polling, we're adamantly banging this drum every day. We've done it for the last couple of years, but most of the country is now just coming to this, and they're quote unquote, they're woke. The first question they're going to have is, how come I've never heard of this in the last 20 years? Why is it guys like Kevin Freeman on Blaze or Steve Bannon at Breitbart or these other guys I don't see this on the main business papers. I don't see this in the New York Times business section. I don't see this on the CNN. I don't see this on the shows that deal with business or the Sunday talk shows. Why are we finding out about this in April of 2020?
Well, the people that would tell you, the elitists, have either been co-opted, meaning they've been bought off, and they regularly have. I'll tell you a quick story on that. I was at the Heritage Foundation. I gave a talk on this with my second book, Game Plan. And afterwards, a woman walks up to me. She's obviously Chinese. She introduces herself. She hands me her business card. She's at one of the major universities there. I look at it politely. I look at her, and I said, "You're PLA, aren't you? People's Liberation Army of China." And she smiles. I caught her off guard, and she says, "Yes." And she bows her head and says, "Yes." I said, "Okay, now I know you're PLA, and did I say anything that was wrong?" And she said, "No, everything you said is true." And I said, "Okay, well, if it's all true and you're doing all of these things, are you going to whack me? Is the PLA going to come after me?" And she said, "Oh, no." I said, "Why not?" She said, "We own half this town." So I asked who owns the other half, and she said the Saudis. But that was brutal honesty. They bought off. And the other side is they're ignorant. People don't want to see. They don't want to know. They buried their head in the sand. And they always say, "Well, China owes us. We owe China a lot of money. Why would they ever hurt us?" I said, "Read the book. If you read the book, you'll understand."
Do you believe our elites? I want to go back to, because you're one of the first ones to kind of identify this. The Chinese, the way they think of the world is that they're the middle kingdom. They're that part between earth and heaven, and the way they look at the world is everybody else is a tributary state. Are we in the United States today a tributary state to the Chinese Communist Party, and have our elites been bought off?
Well, in some ways, voluntarily we are. We don't have to be. Our economy is better, stronger. They don't function effectively without us. If we were to wake up everybody right now and bring back the pharmaceutical supply chain, bring back the manufacturing, not let them continue to cheat on trade, intellectual property theft, manipulate currencies, and so forth. We have a chance that we can wake up and escape from this. I think we're kind of more like the people asleep in the Matrix, hooked up to the machine. Once we wake up from it, we can get away from it. But people need to wake up.
What now, if you were advising the president today, walk us through, like Roger Robinson, we just had him on. He was Reagan's economic warfare advisor. If you were with Brian and Pottinger, the National Security Council, you're advising the president, walk him through the framework that you look at things, and what would be the 2 or 3 things you would tell him, "Mr. President, I think we need to do these today"?
Well, the immediate thing is, and I just did a show of this, it releases today on economicwarroom.com, which is on the farm issue. I mean, because we've shut down our economy, we put our farmers at risk. And our farm at risk means the world's food supply is at risk. So, immediately we need to open on a county by county basis. We helped create a tool with a company called Navigo. It's patriotic engineers did an incredible tool. They looked at every county in America in the midst of the coronavirus, and they found those counties that were safe to open immediately. In fact, we would save more lives opening that county now than keeping it shut down. And he should look at that tool instantly, and we ought to immediately get our economy back to work. The problem is we're in an economic war, and we've told our economy to stand down. That's crazy. How can you fight an economic war if you tell your economy to stand down? So that'd be the first thing I'd say. Absolutely, we have to do that.
You're saying we have to open up and fight on the agriculture side. The trade deal is, the president keeps defending the trade deal, and it's obviously the first step of really us standing up for ourselves as far as the trade war goes. But do you think that's a little bit been overcome by events, and he ought to focus on more of the big issues in capital markets and currency that they're currently attacking us on?
Well, the first thing on the trade deal is that China's not going to keep this. It is not in their nature to keep it. They'll say a pandemic makes it impossible for them to fulfill their part, and that's where they're probably headed. On the currencies, our currency's at risk, and right now the Chinese are creating a cryptocurrency, their own version of it. Their intention, phase 3, I called it in my book 12 years ago when I wrote this. Phase 3 is you just destroy or debase the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency of the world. And it won't happen so dramatically that people just say, oh, they're doing this to us. Instead, it's going to be the International Monetary Fund. It's going to be the World Bank. It's going to be China and Russia and a few allies. And then the Europeans come alongside and say, it's ridiculous that the dollar is the sole primary reserve currency of the world. We ought to have a basket of currencies, maybe the SDRs, and they'll ask for the Chinese currency to be included among it. So it looks like it's a gradual effect. But that's happening right now because they want to remove our ability to fight this economic war. The Chinese coronavirus takes down our economy. You tell them to stand down, and you remove the U.S. dollar as the primary reserve currency of the world, and basically it's over in that fight.
Kevin, I want to be very specific here for our audience because we're trying to coach people up. And we have a lot of hedge fund people and a lot of the news producers, all the shows listen. But we're principally here for the deplorables. Talk to people. We got a couple of minutes left, like 3 minutes. Walk people through what is the prime reserve currency, why we are the prime reserve currency, and why it makes a difference in their life as a working class and middle class citizen of the United States of America.
Well, first, let me say that China is not in a position to replace the U.S. dollar today, probably not a month from now or a year from now, but they are in a position to force the international institutions to say, when I trade for goods and services between two nations, let's say an African nation and Russia or China or India, why do we have to use a U.S. dollar to do that? We should trade in our own currency, or better yet, a global currency. And so the push is they want to make international trade done in different currencies other than primarily the U.S. dollar. Why that matters to us is we have a $25 trillion debt right now, and part of it, a good part of it, is financed by foreigners. And the only reason that foreigners want to hold our debt is they think that it's a solid currency that is used for international trade. Now, with oil prices down, people aren't trading much oil. And because of that, the demand for dollars is going down. Right now, the demand for dollars is good. But when we get past this crisis, the Chinese are going to push no longer use dollars. And if they succeed, what happens is we're going to find it hard to sell our debt overseas. And if we can't sell our debt overseas, the only thing we can do is sell it to the American people or monetize it through the Federal Reserve. That's how countries get into hyperinflation. That's how currencies get destroyed.
Are we? Could we become Argentina if we allow the dollar not to be the prime reserve currency?
We head that direction. It is possible we become Zimbabwe, Argentina, Venezuela, Weimar Germany. If we print money and spend money and increase our debt, rack up the massive debts like we're doing, and we don't have the tax revenues to offset it, we either have to raise taxes dramatically, which crushes the economy, or we have to print the money. And if we print the money, yes, that is how great nations' currencies fail, is they print the money, and that if it's not the reserve currency, nobody's out there outside of the country looking for it. So you're just printing money, and it becomes eventually worthless.
We got about a minute left, Kevin, before we talk about your books and how to get access to you. But as you look at this, we've hit for liquidity, used essentially a $6 trillion liquidity bazooka at the Federal Reserve. We've kind of merged Treasury and the Federal Reserve together. What kind of concerns do you have that this quantitative easing, this massive quantitative easing, is just blowing up the balance sheet of the United States of America?
Well, it's absolutely blowing up the balance sheet. Here's the reality. Our economy produces about $5.5 trillion a quarter. The government broke that with the stand down, shut down, quarantine, and so forth. And understandably, I get the reasons behind it, but they have to fill that hole. If you break it, you buy it. So the government's at fault and responsible, and they've filled in by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury and giving income to people, $1,200 checks, the PPP and all of that, to the tune of almost $6 trillion when you add it all up over time. But the real The real person who broke this is China. The way they handled the coronavirus, the way they let it out without admitting to the world what was going on, bringing the world in, they're the ones culpable. They're the ones that must pay for this. And we've got to have a strategic approach to getting China to help pay to rebuild this. That's the focus.
Kevin, we'll have you back on the show another time to talk about that. Last thing, how do people get more access to you? Your Twitter feed, how do they get access to your books? You wrote the original textbook on this. How do people get to it?
EconomicWarRoom.com is the one-stop shop. It's got links to our Twitter feed, Facebook, YouTube page, XOTV page, all our social media. So it's EconomicWarRoom.com.
Kevin, thank you very much. Great American patriot. Honored to have you on the show.
Thank you, Steve.
Kevin Freeman, at the tip of the spear of economic war. And that's where we're in a hot war with the Chinese Communist Party. Jack Maxey and I will come. Jack will join me for some commentary, observation, analysis. We return on War and Pandemic. Committee on the President Danger Special. Back in a moment.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to this special edition, the Committee on the Present Danger, China. We're dealing all week with the Chinese Communist Party's geopolitical and war strategy, both information, cyber, and economic war against its own citizens, the citizens of the United States of America, and mankind. I want to turn now to Jack Maxey. Jack, you've been focused on food security, the famine. You just heard Kevin Freeman, who is the world's expert in economic warfare. First thing he goes to is food. He's saying, hey, we got to open the country up. We got to get back to our real geopolitical advantage. One of those is food. Where do we stand today? Because we had Governor Perdue, Sonny Perdue, the agriculture secretary, in the Rose Garden 2 weeks ago telling us everything's fine. And then we find out that we're locking down half the plants or a third of the production, 40%. Somebody said up to 80%. The president had to drop the hammer yesterday and say, hey, Defense Production Act, you got to go back to work and we got to figure out the separation, everything like that. Where do we stand right now with food security? And is the CCP looking at that as a major weakness for the United States?
Well, I think the CCP is looking at it as a major weakness for them as well, right? They have theoretically enough grain to feed themselves, but they don't have enough grain to feed their livestock, their chickens, their pork, their everything else. So they require cooperation with us. I think the biggest problem that we're having here in the United States is simply transportation, getting the stuff from the fields to the markets, to the distributors, and to the abattoirs. I also think that
you're saying we're having the transportation problem now. You can see that on the long haul trucking and also the intermediate trucking.
Absolutely, because let's say you're a guy who your job is hauling hogs from the farm to the abattoir, and that gets disrupted. Well, you're out of work. That was your job. You did that 6 days a week. So we're seeing that across the supply chain, and you're seeing it in different places around the country. For example, I was contacted by some guys down in North Carolina. They say pork is everywhere. They're trying to dump it on the market, but then people in Wisconsin don't have access to it. So
it's different in different regions of the country?
It's different in different regions of the country. I totally agree with them because I also think that one of the fundamental points of leverage that we have with the Chinese is food. You can't eat dollars, but you can eat the agricultural production of the United States of America.
Let's go back to food for a second. How does Smithfield, my 98-year-old dad brought this up years ago about allowing foreign powers to come in and buy strategic companies. This was Smithfield Hams down in Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia in the South Side. It's one of the biggest employers in North Carolina. When they allowed the CCP to buy it, he says, hey, this is going to be a problem. Now, 8 years later, or whatever, 6 years later, you find out that it's actually owned by a foreign power. We had this swine flu that eviscerated their pork population in the summer of 2019. Is this all inextricably linked? Is that swine flu somehow linked to the pandemic we have today? And is their ownership of Smithfield means they ran it not as tight? because people's heads are blowing up now because everything's becoming revealed. And people go, I didn't know Smithfield Hams was owned, Smithfield Pork was owned by the Chinese Communist Party. Walk folks through this.
I think Smithfield Ham is one of those strategic purchases that the Chinese have done, right? They've got to gather assets around the world that can provide them with commodities that they can't produce in China. You're watching this with their attempt to purchase, what, 2/3 of the rainforest of Ecuador for oil exploration. You're seeing that here in the United States. I'm sure as you watch the global economy collapse, you're going to see them coming out there with that money that we just heard about, trying to buy up the assets of the West while they're in distress. And I see them probably heavily in agriculture and probably heavily in energy because both of these prices are low right now.
Jack's going to have a lot more to report on that on our daily show every day from 10 to noon on Thursday and Friday. But I want to go back to you actually got into the Reagan movement and all this Republican Party circle as a young man about communism and being an anti-communist. When you look at, we've had Roger Robinson and Kevin Freeman, people that were there, and particularly Robinson, that fought the Cold War with economic warfare. Walk us through, do you think we're in the same position today with the Chinese as you look at it? People forget how the odds were stacked against us when Reagan came to power in 1980.
I think they are very similar parallels, and you and I spoke about it in the break, and obviously I've read everything I can get my hands on. I watched this. I was a big follower of the Reagan, and many of his senior advisors were mentors of mine. I've never heard it explained so concisely how we buried the Soviet Union economically. And one of the things that I think was a problem back then is the American people and our institutions lack confidence in American exceptionalism and the power of our economy. And I think it should be pointed out to the American people that we don't need China. They need us.
What do they need of ours?
They need our capital. They need our food, right? How much further do you need to go, right? Without those two things, there's
capital,
no life.
food, and technology. If they don't have technology, they don't have, I mean, those three things right there. They need our agricultural products, they need our technology and capital. Here's what upsets me so much. Knowing that we have the high ground, we act as a tributary state. Go back in time and remind people of the mindset of the 70s when people thought the Soviet Union was 10 feet tall.
Well, for example, in the last annual assessment of the Soviet Union, by the year before they collapsed, our vaunted intelligence services had described them as our absolute peer, and that their economy actually may be expanding and become larger than ours in a few years. This shows you just sort of how much we failed, and it's one of the reasons why when you have these great people like a Roger Robinson who can come in and speak common sense to these guys who've been sitting in their cubicles for 40 years just buying into a narrative, a guy like that changed the world. I mean, what an amazing man. Great honor to listen to him speak.
He's fantastic. He's at the tip of the spear. He's on the committee on President Danger. He's got the Prague Institute. He's geared up for battle here as now the American people, with righteous indignation, now turn to take on the next great threat, existential threat to free men and women throughout the world, whether it's Japan, India, Western Europe, Africa, Latin America, from Brazil to South Africa to Indonesia. It's the Chinese Communist Party. Remember, the biggest victims are the Chinese people. It's their war for freedom that will define the first half of the 21st century, and whoever wins that war will write the history of the rest of the 21st century. Stephen K. Bannon, our special on the Committee on the Present Danger, China, how the Chinese Communist Party is at war with its people, the citizens of the United States, and all of mankind. We'll be back tomorrow at 5 o'clock with another special edition. I want to thank the entire production team, America's Voice.News on Dish Channel 219, and John Fredericks Radio Network, Vish, Dan, the entire team, Greg Manns. Thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow at 5.